This was humpback whale poo, and humpback whales are these baleen whales that scoop in huge mouthfuls of krill, and these krill are orangey in colour, so their poop just consists of this krill, and it was incredible to see. It smelled absolutely revolting, but the scientists were really excited about it.
What's orange, glittery, and is helping to fight climate change?
It is unexpectedly whale poo. Disco droppings of the deep.
Yeah, this natural glitter bomb is rich in carbon. It eventually sinks to the ocean floor, where it's stored, locked up there, away from the atmosphere.
But we're not done with whales' bodily fluids and climates yet. Oh no.
No, some experts even find their earwax exciting.
This week on The Climate Question, we're asking,
what can whales tell us about climate change? From the BBC World Service, I'm Greer Jackson.
And I'm Jordan Dunbar. Greer, you told me the most mind-blowing fact yesterday about whales.
I did. And this was because I was asking you if you'd seen a whale before, and you said no.
No.
And I said not even a dolphin, because dolphins are, in fact, whales.
What?
And then you realise you've actually seen loads.
Porpoises, yes, but you're also
whales.
I don't think many people know that.
No, they come in a huge variety of shapes, sizes. They live in lots of different places: hot water, cold water, salt water, fresh water. There's loads of them. And as I was doing my deep dive into whales, I also learned something that I found really interesting. So if you go back in the past, into their evolutionary past, they share a common ancestor with hippos. Both watery animals, but very, very different, right?
Never have thought that.
No, I know. And one final fact, if I may, their tails are called flukes, and you can tell a lot about a whale from its fluke.
Dolphins aren't dolphins, porpoises aren't porpoises, tails aren't tails, they're flukes. It's so many I wish I'd worn a helmet to work, Greer, because you've been blowing my mind.
Oh, God,
with these facts.
Well,
it's not just me, because our producers, inspired by these little known whale facts, have actually set up a quiz for us, true or false. I've not seen these questions. You've not seen these questions.
No, and we haven't seen the answers either.
And this is just to let people understand quite how complex, interesting, and wonderful
and the
species
production
are.
values are excellent here, guys. So Jordan, you take the...
I'm going to start. So I'm going to read the question. We'll both say whether we think it's true or false.
Yeah.
And then I'll open it up and read the answer.
Okay.
Whale songs can last up to 30 minutes.
What do you think? So the thing that was going through my mind is some whales don't sing. Some whales... yeah, only certain varieties of whales sing.
This is a slightly unfair
whales.
quiz, I'm already seeing.
And I think the humpback's probably the most famous one, right? And I know they can go underwater for like 45 minutes an hour. That's how much breath they've got, right? So could they sing for like half of that or 2/3 of that?
I was going to say true. It depends how chatty the whale is. Based on my...
My inkling is... My inkling is true. I think
True?
I think maybe they could sing for longer. But okay, let's go with true.
True.
Whoa, 1-1.
Humpback whales can sing songs lasting up to 30 minutes. Although each song is made up of repeated themes. Whale songs vary by region, e.g. the whales of the Southern Ocean sing different songs from their Northern Ocean counterparts.
Accents, just like us.
Amazing. Songs can also vary by species and population group and can evolve over time. The longest whale song ever recorded by scientists is apparently about 22 hours.
22 hours?
It's a very chatty whale.
22 hours?
Yep.
How can someone talk solidly for 22 hours? That sounds exhausting. They must have a lot to talk about.
Lot to say.
Should we do the next one?
Go
So
for it.
this is true or false. Whales can headbutt their way through ice. I think it depends on the thickness, doesn't it?
I think it depends on the whale.
Yeah, like a narwhal. Isn't that what its unicorn is for?
You know, I... gonna say false.
I'm just going to say true to be different to you. Otherwise, it's going to be a very boring quiz.
Okay.
Isn't it? Should we see the answer? It's true!
Hi.
The bowhead whale, or the Arctic whale, can do this, typically when finding their way through melting ice floes in spring. Their heads are 20 to 100 centimetres thick.
Whoa.
Wow, a metre thick. Their head is a metre thick, and their mouths are the largest of any animal on Earth.
To be fair, if the question was, can this special whale with a special thick head headbutt through ice, I would have said...
Don't put the complaints to me. Don't be bitter about being wrong.
Okay. Final question. Sperm whales sleep on their sides, i.e. horizontally.
I think this is true. I don't know why I think this is true, but I think it's true.
I'm going to say true as well, simply because if it's true, it's a great fact. Ready?
Yeah.
False.
Oh, disappointing.
Sperm whales sleep standing up, i.e. vertically, dangling their tail downwards. Whales sleep by switching only half of their brain off at a time. This position makes it easiest for a dozing whale to breathe out of its blowhole.
Curious, because their blowhole is on their back rather than like it's not like they have noses like us. How? But even them sleeping that way is kind of weird. Anyway, shall we move on from our whaley wondrous quiz about whales? Because it's been a bit of a challenge to try and untangle the complicated dynamic between whales, their food, and how they store carbon. And now scientists across the world have gathered together and they are looking at the soil at the bottom of the Antarctic Ocean to find answers.
What a job. So not only do you have to go to the ends of the earth to study this, but you also have to go to the bottom of the seas.
Yeah, that's where
Not
their
easy.
poo ends up, but also their dead bodies.
It's quite grim. I know it's going to be interesting, but that's quite a grim description, isn't it?
And the experts can see how much carbon is down there, where the carbon comes from, because they use like clever little techniques like DNA sequencing within the carbon, and then how that carbon has changed over time.
So we spoke previously with Victoria Gill, who's the science and climate correspondent for BBC News, and she told us all about this.
Hi, Jordan. Hi, Greya. Lovely to be here.
So tell us about this story about the Antarctic seabed. What are scientists doing with this marine sediment?
It's a very ambitious project. So this is a part of a global mission to understand the relationship between the ocean and the climate. It's something that you guys will talk about on this podcast quite a lot. You know, most of our planet is ocean. It has a really important role in absorbing not just kind of warmth out of the atmosphere, but also dissolving CO2, that nasty greenhouse gas that we're pumping too much of into the atmosphere. So these researchers, they're part of a mission called the Convex Seascape Survey. So they've been around a part of the Antarctic called the Antarctic Peninsula, which is like the bit that sticks up out of the Western Antarctica. It's kind of the bit that's closest to Argentina. And they've gone around that in a research vessel, and they've drilled at certain points where they're interested to get these sections of seafloor for all of this evidence of what's been laid down over time. They've sent down a drill and dug up cores of this seabed. And it's really important to maintain it in these long tubes, these long cores, because it keeps all those layers of sediment that have been laid down over years, over centuries. And so you can go back in time and look at the history of what is stored there, what lives in the seabed, what lived and died there. You can even look at DNA. So that's what this team has done. They're a global team. They're from a number of universities all around the world. But earlier this year, they all set out together in this research vessel in lashing icy winds and with rough seas. When they got to the right spot, even if it was the middle of the night, they had to just send their drill down. So that's what they've come back with, and that's what we've been finding out about what analysis they're going to do with these long tubes of mud.
Yeah, I think of it as like pages in a book, these layers of mud, right? Each page has a slightly different story to tell. And I suppose the story that we're interested in is the carbon dioxide, right? How that has changed over time. Why would it change over time? What are the sort of dynamics that change it?
There's lots of reasons why, right? And the scientists, I mean, to be fair, that's a key question for them, is about how that carbon, because, you know, the carbon is absorbed by plants and creatures and living things in the ocean. And then when they die or when they poo, or, you know, all of these different systems of living things that are going on in the ocean, some of that material will sink. And it's when that material sinks and is buried in the seabed, that's when we can call it, stored, sequestered carbon. That's when it's being taken away from the atmosphere for centuries. So that's really important if you think of, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. That's why how much carbon is in the seabed is a really important question. And one of the really interesting things they want to ask is actually how the relationship between the huge whales, some of the biggest marine mammals, the biggest animals on Earth that live in that ocean and feed in that ocean and live and die in that ocean and sink to the bottom, what their relationship is between how much carbon is stored there as well. Because, of course, humans spent a long time in Antarctica hunting whales almost to extinction. So you could actually, and this is what these scientists want to do, they want to be able to track what that did to the health of the ocean and to the amount of carbon that's stored down there.
How are whales doing today? I'm just thinking all that time ago, populations might have rebounded somewhat. Are they still rebounding? And how does climate affect them? And therefore, how much carbon is now sinking to the ocean floor?
The sort of top line good news is that when industrial whaling, which was, really intense. This was a global mission for around about a century, that ships went particularly down to kind of the reachable parts of Antarctica, where all of these whales, these huge whales, the humpback whales, the blue whales, the really, really big animals would migrate down there and feed. And the good news is that they've really made a recovery from that industrial whaling. But then the bad news is that as the climate shifts and as the sea temperatures change, and as that has an effect on the sea ice, which is actually a really important place for the productivity of that very, very cold sea, the krill that they feed on, the plants that those krill feed on, they depend on that sea ice. They exist and function on the underside of that sea ice. So the loss of that and the rising temperatures is having a bit of an unpredictable effect on whales. So while they're making this amazing comeback and they've seen a real rebound and recovery in lots of species, what's happening today is a really open question. And that's why there's a need for this research to gather, physical evidence of what is happening in the Southern Ocean.
I've also been reading, Vic, that in a year where there's low ice, the following year there are less baby whales produced. Is that right?
Yeah, this is a piece of evidence that emerged quite recently that just shows how important that relationship between sea ice and marine life that lives on those very, very productive oceans and lives on the krill that depend on the sea ice and how interconnected everything is. Because it looks like from an effort to monitor whales by looking at they have a sort of fingerprint pattern on their flukes. So scientists have this kind of global mission to ask people to sort of spot different populations. There are efforts all over the world to watch them as they're migrating and to monitor them in Antarctica. And as far as we can tell, mothers are less able to look after their young and feed themselves and produce that incredibly rich milk. I mean, you can it's barely imaginable just how much of a demand on a female's body it must be to produce a baby whale. So, this is something that means that these animals have to just eat huge amounts of food. And when there's less sea ice, they seem to be able to eat less. And that means that they can either maintain a pregnancy less easily or look after their young less easily and produce milk.
So let me make sure I've understood you, Vic. So basically, sea ice is really important for the algae, these little tiny microscopic plants that are absorbing carbon dioxide from the sky and turning it into their bodies. The krill then eats that off the ice, the algae, and then the whales then eat the krill. And all of that means that carbon dioxide is coming from the atmosphere via the algae, via the krill, into the whales, and then eventually down to the seafloor, either through whale poop or a dead whale. Which reminds me, in the doc you made last year when you went to the Antarctic, didn't you see whale poop? And wasn't it pink and sparkly? Have I remembered that right?
I just remember one of the researchers that we were with getting incredibly excited and grabbing for a beaker and scooping up as much of this whale poo as possible. And it was kind of bright orange, like peachy orange. And that's because this was humpback whale poo. And humpback whales are these baleen whales that scoop in huge mouthfuls of krill. And these krill are orangey in colour. So they're poop just consists of this krill. And it was incredible to see. It smelled absolutely revolting, but the scientists were really excited about it because all of that kind of dynamic of, eating, pooping, living, dying in the ocean, and kind of, as you say, these big animals that, have a lot of carbon in their bodies, like us, they're sort of made of a lot of carbon. If they die naturally and sink to the bottom of the ocean and take that with them, that means that carbon is buried. That means it's being, pulled away to the bottom of the sea and locked away down there for centuries. That's really, really important. So that's what these scientists are looking at the seabed to find out. They can pull out things like whale DNA. They can measure the amount of carbon. They can date these layers and see how it's changed over time.
You can sort of see why the scientists might be quite excited about collecting whale poop, given it must be quite hard to collect. It disperses very quickly. But I suppose I'm wondering, is this the beginning of finding out how whales are contributing to sequestering carbon? Is this the beginning of understanding that?
I mean, it's a big part of it. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the beginning. It's sort of like with doing any of these stories, all of these big projects where you're gathering evidence, asking questions, doing analysis about how our climate is changing, about biodiversity, especially about difficult to reach parts of the world and parts of the ocean. You're building on a kind of foundation of lots of knowledge. And it's interesting that, these samples, they've gathered up these tubes of mud from the Antarctic seabed. They've shipped them all the way to Europe, like more than 15,000 miles, and then kept them at minus 80 degrees to preserve everything inside, to sort of stop any cellular processes or any life in its tracks, so they can sort of cryogenically preserve it, and then shared it with scientists all around the world, as far as elsewhere in Spain, but also in Saudi Arabia. There's some work going on in the United States. It's a global effort because these samples are so precious and you can get so much information from them.
Wow. Well, it's going to be really exciting to see what kind of results they'll be yielding. I mean, it strikes me that you never seem to do a story on dry land. You're always out in the ocean somewhere. Anyway, appreciate it so much, and lovely to talk to you, Vic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vic.
Oh, always a pleasure. Thank you so much, guys.
I mean, hearing how difficult it is to get that data, do you think that's why people don't have an appreciation of how much the oceans and whales could be doing in terms of storing all of this carbon? Because I read that they think they might, on average, be storing 33 tons of carbon, which is more than some big trees store in 500 years.
Yeah, it's mad. When I read that stat, I was really surprised to hear how much whales might be sort of drawing down, how important they might be in the fight against climate change. And I think the other thing to underscore here from what Vic said is just that how much oceans are bearing the brunt of climate change. They absorb loads of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is making them more acidic, but they're also absorbing loads of heat, and that means they are warming very, very quickly.
Yeah, and we spoke with someone about the impact that heat might be having on whales, their rising stress levels, and how we might be able to see that relationship through their earwax.
Yes, earwax. You heard us right. We spoke to Professor Helen Czerski on the climate question recently all about this. She's a physicist and an oceanographer at University College London in the UK, and she's written a book called The Blue Machine: How the Ocean Shapes Our World.
Sound is really important in the ocean, and one of my favourite examples of this comes from the earwax of whales. Now, whale earwax raises a few questions, because the first one is, why do whales have earwax? And that is because whales evolved from land mammals that were like us. They had ears that were very similar to us. And around 60 million years ago, those animals started to move into the ocean and became adapted for ocean life. And so the first thing is that if you're swimming through the water, you want to reduce drag. And that means sticky out things like ears really get in the way. So whales' ears, proto-whales' ears, got smaller and smaller and smaller. But that was okay because they weren't hearing through their ears anyway. When you or I put a head underwater, it sounds a bit different. And that's partly because the sound underwater is different, but it's mostly because we're not hearing through our ears, we're hearing through our jaws.
Really?
So water is very, very dense, and the sound that travels through it comes and arrives at your face. Now, your ear is a little machine for taking sound in air and moving it into water, which is inside the ear where the sensing happens. So an ear that takes air from air into water is no use underwater, so it doesn't do anything. but the sound that is traveling through the water will hit your jaw, the bones of your skull, and they're very similar. So it'll just go straight in, and then it's channeled up your jaws, and that basically takes you right to your inner ear where the sensing is. So when early whales started to move into the water, they just started hearing through their jaws. So they weren't hearing through the hole. So the hole kind of covered over with a flap of skin, and the whales carried on hearing through their jaws, and whales carried on. But evolution's really untidy. And so all of the mechanisms inside just stayed the same. There was no reason for them to change, no evolutionary pressure either way. So whales kept producing earwax, except now there's a little flap of skin over the top. The earwax would just kind of build up on the inside, like pushed up the tube. And so adult whales have these 2 plugs of earwax, which are kind of layers of all the wax that's been produced during their life, just sort of stuck in there. And because this isn't living tissue, it isn't replaced. So it's just a record of whatever was going on in the whale's body. So a whale's got a little library in its ear that is just a little library of that whale's life. And so you get these kind of plugs. They're about this long, and they've got stripes in them. And those are plugs of whale earwax. And a few years ago, scientists at the Natural History Museum and the American Museum of Natural History realised that between them they had lots of these earwax plugs. But because they're curators in very organised museums, they knew when the whales had died. And that meant they could put a date on every stripe going down the earwax plug. And that meant they could line up the earwax going back 150 years for global whales. So this was blue whales and fin and sei whales. So they could look at all these whales, they could line up all the earwax, and they have this record for 150 years in whale earwax. So what do you go looking for if you've got this? They went looking for a stress hormone called cortisol. And what they saw is that there are huge spikes. There's a really clear pattern in whale stress over the decades. It goes up and down. And then next to that, they plotted industrial whaling numbers. There are very good records of the number of whales that were being killed. And it pretty much matches all the time. They go up and down together. There's an enormous peak in the early 1970s, just before whaling was banned. But there's this one bit where it doesn't match. And the bit where it doesn't match is during the Second World War, when the humans were very busy killing each other. So they stopped killing whales. So the whale kills go down, but the stress goes up. The stress, so cortisol is measuring whale stress. And the explanation is that what was stressing the whales out was noise, guns, bombs, destroyers, torpedoes, all the sounds of battle at sea are filling the whales' auditory space. And of course, underwater, they can't see very far, but they really use sound to understand their environment. So basically, there's this constant background racket, and it is stressing the whales out. And you can see it written in their earwax.
Can you see climate change written in their earwax?
That's more complicated because there are many stressors on whales. So the water is heating up. That's where you might see it. But their food sources are moving around. There's pressure on them, not so much from whaling, but from ship strikes and things like that. There's also sound from our modern ships. So there is the paper that published that initial study has shown an increase in recent whale stress, but it's not clear. There are lots of things that it's due to, and it's probably due to a combination of them. So any one of those things by themselves, the whales might be kind of okay with. But you know yourself when you have a bad day, right? When you break something and then, someone's late and then you've forgotten your lunch and then it becomes very stressful. And basically that's the situation the whales are in now.
Earwax is so disgusting. It gives me such heebie-jeebies to even think about.
But absolutely incredible how many different things that both whales do for us and how we can look at this relationship of how we use the ocean, how the ocean's changing, and what it might mean through even the medium of earwax, which is not something I thought about.
No, would you donate your earwax for a scientific study?
It'd be interesting to see what my earwax said after doing this show. After us working together.
So rude.
It'd show I was happy, relaxed, and more informed.
Good. Well, that is where we must leave it. Thank you so much for watching. And don't forget to subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing.
And if you have a climate question of your own, we always want to hear from you. You can write it in the comments below. I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Greer Jackson, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.